The grand ballroom of the Riverside Hotel shimmered like a dream, sculpted out of glass and gold, its walls echoing with laughter and the soft hum of an orchestra playing beneath the glittering crystal chandeliers. The city's elite had gathered for the annual Children's Hope Foundation Gala, a place where reputation sparkled brighter than the diamonds on display, and where every smile was a carefully crafted mask. Among the crowd stood Emma Richards, a woman whose beauty had become her currency, her armor, and her prison all at once. Dressed in an emerald green gown that hugged her silhouette like a whisper of silk, she moved with grace that had been rehearsed through years of pretending everything was perfect. The sapphire necklace around her throat glinted against her skin, but inside her chest there was a heaviness no jewel could disguise. Across the room, Daniel Richards, her husband, stood tall and magnetic, surrounded by businessmen whose laughter rose and fell like waves in a sea of arrogance. Daniel was a man who knew how to command attention. His silver-threaded hair, his sharp jawline, his tailored suit that cost more than Emma's first car. He was every bit the image of power. Once that confidence had drawn her to him like light to a moth. Now it repelled her, not because of what he had become, but because of what she had lost to keep his world spinning. He was 42, successful, admired, envied, and utterly unreachable. 5 years into their marriage, Emma could no longer tell if he loved her, or simply loved what she represented. A trophy polished to perfection for others to admire. The orchestra played a slow waltz as Emma crossed the marble floor, her heels echoing softly against the polished stone. She wore her smile like a veil, greeting old acquaintances, shaking hands, exchanging hollow compliments. Every woman in that room measured her hair, her gown, her poise, as if she were a piece of art hung up for evaluation. They called her lucky, envied her lifestyle, her mansion, her husband's wealth. But none of them saw the truth hidden behind her practiced grace, a woman fading bit by bit, behind a facade she had helped build. When she finally approached Daniel's circle, the moment froze like a still frame from a film. The photographer from City Life magazine was already waiting, his camera ready to immortalize the image of the perfect couple. Daniel noticed her coming and turned with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Gentlemen," he said, placing a possessive hand around her waist. "My wife, Emma." The men greeted her politely, their gazes respectful yet assessing, another kind of inspection, one she had grown painfully accustomed to. The photographer lifted his camera, his voice cheerful. "Mr. and Mrs. Richards, could we get a shot of you both together? Maybe stand a little closer, and yes, perfect." Emma took a gentle step forward, her shoulder brushing Daniel's chest. She caught the faint scent of his cologne, once comforting, now strangely foreign. And then it happened. That moment that would replay in her mind again and again like a cruel echo. Daniel's smile stiffened. His voice, calm and clear, cut through the chatter around them. "Look beautiful, darling," he said lightly, though his tone carried a blade's edge. "But perhaps stay a bit back. We wouldn't want to crowd the frame." For a split second, silence claimed the air around them. The photographer hesitated, unsure whether to laugh or apologize. Conversations faltered. Every pair of eyes nearby turned toward her. Emma's smile stayed frozen, her hand tightening slightly around her glass, her knuckles white against the stem of the flute. She could feel her face flush, not with embarrassment, but with the sting of betrayal. He had said it so casually, like an offhand remark, but it carried the weight of something deeper: rejection, disdain, humiliation. The women around her exchanged quick glances. Some smiled faintly in sympathy, others with amusement. The photographer took the shot quickly, capturing a moment that would later appear flawless on glossy paper. But only she would remember the truth beneath it. In that instant, something inside her cracked, a soundless fracture that began in her heart and spread through her soul. When the photo session ended, Daniel returned to his conversation as if nothing had happened. Emma stood for a moment, her chest tight, her breath shallow. The chandelier's light fractured in her teary eyes, turning the world into a blur of gold and glass. Without a word, she excused herself, moving toward the powder room. The whispers followed her, the kind of whispers that cling to silk gowns and expensive perfume. Inside the mirror-lined room, Emma stopped before her reflection. The woman staring back at her looked perfect. Every hair in place, every stroke of makeup flawless. But the eyes in those eyes told another story. They were tired, empty, searching. For a long time she simply stood there, her mind spinning through memories of how it all began. She had met Daniel when she was 24, a bright art student working part-time at a gallery. He had walked in, confident and charming, buying not just a painting but her dreams. He promised her a life of comfort, of elegance, of love. He had given her everything, except freedom. Over the years she had given up her art, her friends, her laughter, piece by piece, offering them on the altar of his ambitions. At first it seemed worth it. He needed her support, her presence at events, her charm to balance his intensity. But somewhere along the way she became invisible. She was no longer Emma, the woman with dreams and fire. She was Mrs. Richards, the wife who looked good beside him. And tonight, in front of everyone, he had confirmed what she had feared all along. She was decoration, not partner. She pressed her palm against the cold marble counter, breathing deeply, steadying herself. The humiliation burned through her like fire, but beneath that flame another spark began to flicker, one she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't anger. It was resolve. The quiet, trembling kind that begins when a person finally reaches the end of endurance. She looked back into her own eyes and whispered softly, "You deserve better than this." The words sounded foreign, but powerful. For the first time, she didn't just think them. She believed them. When she returned to the ballroom, the night had begun to fade. Guests were leaving, the orchestra slowing to a graceful close. Daniel waited near the exit, scrolling through his phone. His indifference cut deeper than his earlier words. "You vanished for a while," he said coolly when she approached. "People noticed." Emma met his gaze, her voice calm. "Yes, they noticed what you said too." Daniel's brow furrowed. "You're too sensitive, Emma. It was just a joke." But she could see it in his eyes. It wasn't a joke, and he knew it. He simply didn't care. The car ride home was silent. The city lights streaked across the tinted windows, flickering like fading dreams. Emma stared out, her reflection overlapping with the blurred lights, a ghost caught between two worlds. Daniel typed away on his phone, detached, distant. When they reached the mansion, that sprawling monument to success, she stepped out first, her heels clicking against the stone driveway. Inside, the air was still, sterile. Every piece of art, every polished surface screamed perfection but felt lifeless. She moved through the grand hallway, past portraits and furniture that looked like museum pieces. It wasn't a home. It was a cage dressed in luxury. Upstairs, she undressed slowly, placing her jewelry carefully back in their boxes, folding her gown neatly, a ritual she had performed countless times. But tonight, each gesture felt final, as though she were shedding the last pieces of someone else's story. Standing in her nightgown, she looked at herself in the mirror one more time. For years, she had allowed him to define her worth. For years, she had accepted being a reflection of his pride. But now she saw the truth. Her beauty was never the problem. It was his blindness. She whispered the words that had shattered her earlier that evening, repeating them with new meaning. "Look beautiful, but stay away from me." This time she smiled faintly. "Gladly," she murmured to her reflection. Outside, the night was deep and quiet, the moon spilling silver across the gardens. She walked to the window and pressed her hand against the glass, feeling its cold certainty. Somewhere below, Daniel's voice carried from his study, talking business even at this hour. But she no longer listened. In that moment, Emma made a silent promise, not of revenge, not of escape, but of rebirth. She didn't yet know how or when, but she would rise. She would find the girl who once painted colors onto blank canvases and laughter into empty rooms. She would rebuild her world, not for him, but for herself. And when she did, no man, no humiliation, no cruel remark would ever have the power to reduce her again. That night, as the city slept and Daniel's study lights burned late into the morning, Emma Richards closed her eyes not in despair but in awakening. Her tears had dried, her shame transformed into something stronger, the quiet, fierce beginning of change. The woman who had entered that ballroom was gone. What remained was a spark, fragile but real, and in the stillness of her heart, she knew it was only the beginning of a story that would one day make the world listen. The morning sunlight crept gently across the pale curtains, spilling into the room in soft golden ribbons, touching the edges of the bed where Emma lay motionless, her eyes open long before dawn had broken. For years, mornings had meant routine. Wake before Daniel, prepare his breakfast, check the household schedule, and slip seamlessly into the role she was expected to play, graceful, obedient, perfect. But this morning felt different. There was a stillness inside her, a strange calm after the storm that had torn through her soul the night before. The humiliation she had endured at the gala replayed in her mind again and again, like a scene from a film she could not turn off. Yet now it no longer burned. It clarified. She was beginning to see the truth through the smoke of years spent pretending, and for the first time, the reflection staring back at her from the mirror across the room didn't seem weak. It seemed ready. She rose slowly, her bare feet pressing against the cold floor, and walked to the mirror. The woman who stared back was no longer the polished ornament of Daniel Richards. Her eyes looked different, weary but fierce, fragile but alive. She ran her fingers through her hair, pulling it loose from the careful waves Daniel preferred, letting it fall freely across her shoulders. There was liberation in that small act, a rebellion so gentle yet so powerful it made her chest tighten with emotion. She whispered softly to her reflection, "You are enough." Her voice trembled at first, but as she repeated the words, they began to sound real. It wasn't just a statement, and it was a declaration to herself, a promise to stop waiting for permission to exist. Downstairs, she could already hear the sounds of Daniel's routine, the clicking of his coffee cup, the low murmur of the news playing in the background, the hurried rustle of papers as he prepared for another day of empire building. Emma dressed simply, jeans, a plain blouse, her hair tied back. No diamonds, no designer perfume, no pretense. As she entered the kitchen, Daniel glanced up briefly, his expression neutral. "You're not dressed for the brunch at the Harringtons," he said, adjusting his cufflinks. "You'll need to be ready by 11. Emma poured herself a cup of coffee, her movements calm, deliberate. "I'm not going." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Daniel lowered his newspaper, his brow furrowed. "Excuse me?" She looked at him, her gaze steady. "I said, I'm not going. I have something else to do today." Daniel laughed, a short, incredulous sound that dripped with disbelief. "Something else?" "Emma, this event isn't optional. It's networking, it's image. You're part of that image." She set her cup down gently and met his eyes. "That's the problem, Daniel. I've spent years being part of your image. I've forgotten what it's like to be part of my own life." He stared at her, clearly not understanding this version of her, the woman who didn't shrink, who didn't flinch. "You're being dramatic," he said, finally waving her off. "We'll talk about this later." But she knew he wouldn't. Talking had never been his way. Commanding, dismissing, deciding, those were his languages, and she was done speaking them. When he left for work, his expensive car gliding down the driveway, Emma stood at the doorway, breathing deeply. The mansion felt eerily silent once the engine's hum faded into the distance. For years, she had associated that silence with loneliness, with waiting. Waiting for him to return, waiting for purpose, waiting for life to begin again. But now it felt like freedom. She walked through the room slowly, taking in the life she had built around someone else's dreams. Every corner told a story of compromise. The grand piano she never played because Daniel preferred quiet. The art studio turned storage room because his office needed more space. The books she stopped reading because he said novels were a waste of time. Each detail whispered of the woman she used to be. She made her way to the back of the house, to the small door that led to the once vibrant art studio. The air inside was thick with dust, the smell of old paint faint but familiar. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, catching the edges of abandoned canvases and brushes still stiff from years of neglect. Her heart tightened as she ran her fingers over the cracked surface of one of her old paintings, a sunset over a field of wildflowers, bright and unrestrained. It had been her favorite piece once, the one she painted during the happiest days of her youth. She could almost feel that girl again, barefoot, hopeful, fearless. Something inside her stirred. Not just memory, but hunger. A hunger for expression, for freedom, for something that was hers alone. She found one of her old sketchbooks, its leather cover worn and edges frayed. When she opened it, the scent of paper and charcoal filled the air. Pages upon pages of half-finished dreams greeted her. Portraits, landscapes, ideas she had once loved but abandoned. As she sat down on the old stool by the window, she picked up a pencil. It felt awkward at first, like meeting an old friend after years apart. But as the tip touched paper, something electric surged through her fingers. The lines came shaky at first, hesitant, but soon began to flow, guided by emotion rather than skill. Tears blurred her vision, but she kept drawing. Each stroke was a confession, each curve a release. For hours she lost herself in that small space, rediscovering a language she had silenced for too long. It was not about perfection. It was about presence. The more she drew, the more she felt alive, truly alive, in a way she hadn't since her early 20s. When she finally looked at the sketch she had created, she saw not just a face but a message. A woman breaking through glass, eyes fierce with determination. It was her story captured without words. She smiled through her tears. By evening, her hands were smudged with charcoal, her hair messy, her heart strangely light. She had no idea where this path would lead, but for the first time in years she didn't need to know. She simply needed to keep moving forward. When Daniel returned that night, tired and impatient, he noticed the light on in the studio, a room he had almost forgotten existed. He paused by the door, watching her quietly for a moment. "I didn't know you still painted," he said, his voice distant, almost curious. Emma looked up at him, her face calm but unreadable. "Neither did I," she replied. He gave a slight shrug and walked away, leaving her in the quiet. That night, after he had gone to bed, Emma sat by the window with her sketchbook in her lap. She thought about the years she had spent shrinking to fit someone else's expectations, about the countless times she had silenced her own voice for the sake of peace. She realized that peace bought with submission was not peace at all. It was surrender. And she was done surrendering. She took out her old laptop, opened it for the first time in ages, and began searching for local art workshops and exhibitions. There was a small community center downtown that offered free creative classes for women rediscovering their passions. Something about it called to her. She signed up without hesitation. Over the next few weeks, she began to carve out pieces of herself from the life that had swallowed her whole. She spent her mornings painting, her afternoons attending workshops, and her evenings walking through the city streets she once loved but had long abandoned. With every passing day, she felt her spirit growing, tentative but unstoppable. The women she met in those classes inspired her. Single mothers, retirees, dreamers, all fighting to reclaim something they had lost along the way. She wasn't alone in her struggle. She was part of something larger, something healing. One afternoon, the instructor, an older woman named Clara with kind eyes and paint-stained fingers, placed a hand on Emma's shoulder as she worked on a new piece. "You've got something powerful in your art, dear," she said softly. "Pain that's turning into purpose. Don't let anyone take that away from you again." Emma felt her throat tighten as she nodded. Those words lingered long after the class ended. At home, Daniel grew increasingly frustrated with her absence from social events, her disinterest in maintaining the perfect image. "People are asking where you've been," he said one night over dinner. "You're embarrassing me." Emma met his gaze calmly. "I'm finding myself," she said simply. "If that embarrasses you, that's your problem, not mine." His fork froze midway, his expression darkening. "You're being selfish," he snapped. But she didn't flinch. "No," she said softly, her voice steady. "For the first time, I'm not." That night, Emma didn't cry. She didn't argue. She simply packed away her sketchbooks, cleaned her brushes, and placed her new paintings by the wall, each one more vibrant, more alive than the last. As she looked at them, she realized she wasn't painting for validation anymore. She was painting for freedom. And as the moonlight poured through her window once again, the same window where she had once whispered her silent vow, she smiled faintly. The awakening had begun, and though the road ahead was uncertain, she knew there was no turning back. The girl who had once lived in the shadow of another's ambition had returned, not as a decoration, not as a victim, but as a woman reborn, quietly powerful, beautifully alive, and ready to reclaim every lost piece of her soul. The air in the city felt different that morning, brisk and alive, as though the universe itself had decided to exhale after holding its breath for too long. Emma stood at the edge of the pedestrian bridge overlooking the river, her fingers wrapped around the cold railing, watching the sunlight scatter across the rippling water. It had been months since the night that had changed her life forever, months since she had begun the quiet journey of reclaiming her identity from the shadows of Daniel's dominance. The city that once seemed distant and impersonal now felt like a living, breathing companion. Every face that passed, every voice in the crowd reminded her that life still moved forward. And she, for the first time in years, was moving with it. She had grown into a rhythm that felt entirely her own. Her mornings were no longer dictated by schedules or appearances, but by inspiration. Sometimes she woke before dawn, brewing coffee while the world still slept, sitting by the window with her sketchpad open, the early light pouring over blank pages that soon filled with colors and shapes. Her paintings had begun to evolve, no longer confined to sadness or longing, but alive with expression. They told stories of resilience, of hope breaking through pain, of transformation. Every stroke of her brush carried a piece of her healing, and every finished canvas was proof that she had survived. The art workshops had become more than a creative outlet. They were her sanctuary. The small studio downtown was always buzzing with laughter, energy, and the kind of warmth that didn't require pretense. The other women there had become her family in a way she hadn't realized she needed. There was Clara, her mentor, whose wisdom seemed to pour out of every wrinkle around her kind eyes. There was Maya, a single mother who painted dreams on canvas while juggling 3 jobs. And Lila, a quiet woman rediscovering herself after losing her husband. Together they shared stories, tears, and laughter, each of them broken in their own way, yet each finding beauty in their cracks. It was Clara who first suggested that Emma should display her art publicly. "You have something special," she said one evening as they cleaned brushes after class. "Not just skill, you have truth. People feel that when they see your work." Emma hesitated. "I haven't shown my paintings to anyone outside the studio in years," she admitted. "I wouldn't even know where to start." Clara smiled knowingly. "Start with courage. The rest will follow." Those words stayed with her long after she went home that night. Back in her studio at home, surrounded by canvases that told the story of her journey, Emma began to imagine what it would feel like to share her work with the world. The idea scared her, not because she doubted her art, but because she knew that stepping into the light meant fully leaving behind the version of herself that Daniel had crafted. She knew he wouldn't approve. But for once, his approval didn't matter. That realization alone was liberation. Over the next few weeks, she worked tirelessly. She painted late into the night, music playing softly in the background, her hands and heart moving in perfect harmony. She created a collection, 15 paintings, each representing a stage of her transformation. The first canvas was dark and muted, reflecting her years of silence. The last one exploded with color, symbolizing freedom and rebirth. She titled the series Becoming. It was more than art. It was her soul on display. When she finally submitted her application to a local art exhibition, she half expected rejection. But a week later, she received the email that made her heart race. "Congratulations. Your work has been selected for the Spring Revival Gallery Showcase." She sat there, staring at the screen, her hands trembling, tears welling in her eyes. For the first time in years, her name was being recognized not as Daniel's wife, but as Emma Richards, the artist, the dreamer, the survivor. When Daniel found out, it was not through her but through one of his acquaintances who had seen the exhibition flyer. He confronted her in the living room, holding the printed brochure in his hand, his voice laced with irritation. "What is this?" he demanded. "You're displaying your paintings? At a public event?" Emma stayed calm, folding her arms as she faced him. "Yes, I am," he scoffed. "And you didn't think to tell me? What will people think if my wife starts dabbling in this hobby like some bored housewife?" Her heart clenched, but her voice stayed firm. "It's not a hobby, Daniel. It's my work, my passion, and I don't need your permission." His expression hardened, his pride wounded. "You're making a fool of yourself," he said coldly. "You're embarrassing me in front of people who respect us." Emma took a deep breath, her voice steady but sharp. "Maybe they respect you because they don't know who you really are. Maybe if they saw the way you treat the people closest to you, they wouldn't respect you so much." For a brief moment, silence filled the room. Thick, charged, unbreakable. Daniel stared at her as though seeing her for the first time, realizing that the woman standing before him was no longer the obedient shadow he had molded. "You've changed," he said finally. She met his gaze with calm defiance. "No," she replied. "I've returned." The night of the exhibition arrived like the beginning of a new chapter. The gallery was alive with music and conversation, the air filled with the faint scent of paint and polish. Elegant guests moved between the displays, glasses of champagne in hand, murmuring admiration for the art that surrounded them. Emma stood near her section, her paintings lined neatly along the wall, each one illuminated under soft lights. She wore a simple navy blue dress, elegant, not extravagant, her hair pulled back to reveal her natural beauty. When people stopped to talk to her, she spoke with confidence, explaining the meaning behind her work, her voice calm yet full of passion. As the evening went on, she noticed familiar faces in the crowd, people from her old social circle, faces she hadn't seen since she'd withdrawn from their glamorous gatherings. There were curious glances, whispers, a few polite smiles. And then, to her quiet astonishment, applause broke out near her section as one of the city's prominent critics praised her art. Raw, emotional, and deeply human, he said. It's rare to see this level of honesty in modern art. Emma felt tears prick her eyes, not from pride but from relief. Relief that her pain had turned into something beautiful, that her voice had finally been heard. And then she saw him, Daniel, standing near the entrance, his expression unreadable. For a moment the old fear flickered in her chest, but it was fleeting. She no longer needed his validation. She walked toward him calmly, her steps measured. "You came," she said softly. He nodded stiffly. "I had to see what all the fuss was about." His eyes scanned the paintings, lingering on the final one, the explosion of color, the phoenix rising from the ashes. "This one," he said slowly, "it's powerful." She smiled faintly. "It's about rebirth, about what happens when you burn everything that destroys you." He looked at her, understanding dawning behind his pride. But before he could speak, someone called her name. A gallery owner interested in her work. She excused herself and walked away, her heart full and unshaken. That night, as she stood on the balcony overlooking the city lights, the cool breeze brushing against her face, she felt a peace she hadn't known in years. She realized that true victory wasn't in proving Daniel wrong or making him regret his cruelty. True victory was in becoming everything she was meant to be despite him. She had risen, not for revenge, not for validation, but for freedom. She had rebuilt herself from ashes, and now she stood as proof that no humiliation, no heartbreak, and no rejection could ever define a soul determined to rise. In that moment, she understood that the journey was far from over. There would still be challenges, still moments of doubt, still days when the past tried to whisper her back into silence. But she also knew that the woman she had become could never again be broken by someone else's words. The phoenix had risen, her wings bright with fire and courage, and the world would never see her the same way again. The weeks that followed the exhibition unfolded like the soft dawn of a long-awaited morning. The world that Emma once viewed through the fog of submission and fear now appeared vivid, alive with possibilities that shimmered in every corner. Her success at the gallery had sparked more than applause. It had sparked recognition. Calls began coming in from local art circles. Journalists requested interviews, and small independent collectors expressed interest in her paintings. At first, she was hesitant to accept the attention, almost shy about her sudden visibility, but Clara's words echoed in her heart every time she doubted herself. "Don't hide from the light you worked so hard to find." So Emma didn't hide. She stepped into that light with grace, not arrogance, and began to rebuild her world piece by piece. Her home, once a cage of silence, slowly transformed into something living and breathing again. She opened the curtains each morning to let the sunlight flood the rooms Daniel had once kept sterile and dim. The sound of her laughter returned, first tentative, then bold. The art studio became the heart of the house. Canvases lining the walls, brushes resting in jars, the scent of fresh paint replacing the cold emptiness of polished marble. Every color she used felt symbolic, a rebellion against the years she had lived in grayscale. Her marriage to Daniel had grown colder than the stone floors beneath their feet. Yet for the first time, Emma did not seek to fix it or mourn it. She simply accepted it for what it had become, a chapter that had served its purpose and was now nearing its end. Daniel had become a ghost in his own home, retreating into his office and business trips, avoiding the uncomfortable truth of a woman he could no longer control. Occasionally, he would attempt to reassert authority with condescending remarks or empty criticism. But his words no longer had weight. They fell flat like echoes fading into a canyon too wide to cross. Emma had stopped reacting, and in doing so, she had taken back every ounce of power he once wielded over her. Her focus was no longer on what she had lost, but on what she could create. One evening, as she sat in her studio surrounded by unfinished pieces, she remembered the women she had met in the workshops, each of them fighting invisible battles, yearning for hope and expression. The idea began as a whisper in her mind, but the more she thought about it, the stronger it grew. What if she created a space for them? A sanctuary where women could find their voices through art, where they could heal through creation just as she had? The next morning, Emma called Clara to share her idea, her voice trembling with excitement. "I want to open a studio," she said. "A place for women. Women like us who've lost themselves somewhere along the way. I want to help them find their way back." Clara's silence on the other end lasted only a moment before it broke into warm laughter. "Emma, my dear, you already have the heart for it. The world needs more places like that. Let's make it happen." And so began one of the most fulfilling journeys of Emma's life. She poured her energy, savings, and heart into creating what she named the Renewal Studio, a space that stood as a testament to everything she had endured and overcome. Located in a quiet corner of the city, the building was simple, but every detail carried her touch. She painted the walls herself, choosing soft shades of cream and gold that reflected light beautifully. Large windows let in the sun, and every corner was adorned with plants and artwork. There were easels lined in rows, shelves filled with art supplies, and a cozy reading area where women could sit with tea and talk. When the Renewal Studio finally opened its doors, the turnout surprised even her. Dozens of women came, some shy, some broken, some eager, each carrying their own silent stories of pain and survival. Emma welcomed them with warmth, her smile genuine and her voice gentle. She began teaching not just painting techniques, but lessons about courage, self-expression, and rediscovering one's worth. She spoke from experience, sharing pieces of her own journey, not to earn sympathy, but to remind them that healing was possible, that no amount of humiliation or heartbreak could permanently erase one's light. Over time, the Renewal Studio grew into more than an art space. It became a community, a movement. Women supported one another, lifting each other through shared stories, laughter, and creativity. Local media began to notice, calling it a sanctuary of strength in the heart of the city. Emma's name appeared in magazines and features, but she remained humble, always redirecting credit to the women whose courage inspired her daily. Daniel watched all this unfold from a distance, confused and quietly resentful. He couldn't understand how the woman he had once silenced had not only found her voice, but had built an entire world around it. His empire of wealth felt strangely hollow compared to the life that bloomed in her studio. He began to attend fewer galas, his circle of influence shrinking while Emma's grew wider. Not in wealth, but in hearts touched and lives changed. Sometimes he would stand outside the Renewal Studio during his drives through the city, watching from the car as Emma laughed among her students, her eyes shining with fulfillment. There was a time when he had believed control was power. Now he saw that her freedom was the truest form of it. One evening, months after the studio's opening, Emma received a letter in the mail. It was from a young woman named Grace who had attended one of her sessions. The letter was simple yet deeply moving. "I was ready to give up on myself," it read, "but your story reminded me that life doesn't end when someone breaks you. It begins when you decide to rebuild. Thank you for giving me that courage." Emma held the letter to her chest, tears filling her eyes. She realized then that her pain had not been in vain. It had become a bridge for others to cross from despair to hope. Her life began to settle into a balance she had never known before. Each morning she would open the studio's doors, greeting familiar faces, guiding hands through strokes of color and lines of emotion. Each evening she would return home to the quiet, where she no longer felt lonely but at peace. She started to plan her future not in reaction to Daniel's presence but in alignment with her own dreams. The distance between them had grown beyond repair, but she no longer mourned it. Love that demanded silence was not love worth keeping. One rainy night, Daniel approached her in the living room, his voice uncertain, softer than she had ever heard it. "Emma," he began, "I've been thinking, maybe we could start over." She looked at him calmly, her expression kind but resolute. "Start over?" she repeated. "Daniel, we can't start over because we never truly started together. You built your world around control, and I built mine around healing. They don't belong in the same place." He said nothing, his eyes reflecting regret he could not put into words. "You once told me to look beautiful but stay away," she continued quietly, "and I did. But in staying away, I found something much more valuable: myself." He stood there in silence for a long moment before finally nodding, realizing the finality of her words. He left without another word, and Emma watched him go with no bitterness, only gratitude. Some endings, she thought, are not meant to be mourned. They are meant to be honored for the lessons they bring. Months later, Emma stood at the center of her studio during its first anniversary celebration. The walls were filled with the artwork of her students, pieces bursting with emotion, resilience, and light. Laughter filled the air as the women celebrated not just art but life. Clara raised a glass and called for a toast. "To Emma," she said proudly, "who showed us that beauty isn't in perfection. It's in survival, in courage, in creation." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Emma's heart was quiet and full. As the night came to an end and she stepped outside into the cool air, she looked up at the stars. The same woman who once stood in a ballroom, humiliated and invisible, was now standing under the open sky, free and fearless. She realized that the world she had built was not made of walls or wealth, but of love, strength, and purpose. She had turned pain into art, silence into voice, and rejection into rebirth. And as she walked home beneath the glow of the city lights, she knew that the woman she had become was not a product of what life had given her, but of what she had created from the ashes. She was no longer defined by anyone's gaze or judgment. She was her own masterpiece, imperfect, radiant, and infinite. The morning of the anniversary of the Renewal Studio's opening dawned with a quiet radiance, the kind that doesn't scream its beauty, but whispers it through sunlight spilling softly over rooftops and the gentle rustle of leaves dancing in a spring breeze. Emma stood by her window, the same one that had once been her only escape, her silent witness to loneliness and awakening alike. Now it opened onto a world she had built herself, not a world of grandeur or luxury, but one of meaning. The garden below bloomed with life, colors spilling over in wild harmony, unplanned yet perfect, much like her journey. There were mornings not too long ago when she would wake with the weight of someone else's expectations crushing her spirit. But today she woke light, her heart full of gratitude, her soul calm in its strength. She sipped her coffee slowly, gazing at the horizon, where the golden edge of the sun touched the sky. Her reflection in the glass no longer looked like a stranger. The woman staring back was confident, content, her face marked not by the absence of struggle but by the grace of survival. She smiled faintly, remembering the woman she once was, standing in that same room in tears, whispering to herself in the dark, unsure of what tomorrow would hold. That woman had been fragile yet brave enough to take the first step, and every step since had carried her here, to this moment of peace earned through storms endured. The studio had grown far beyond anything she had imagined. What began as a small community of women rediscovering their voices had now blossomed into a movement. Her story had inspired countless others, women who had written letters, visited from distant cities, and shared how her courage had given them the strength to break free from silence and fear. The Renewal Studio had become not just a space for art, but a symbol of rebirth. Its walls were filled with laughter, stories, and colors that told a collective narrative of healing. And Emma, once the woman who doubted her worth, was now its heart, guiding, nurturing, teaching, but most importantly, listening. On the day of the second-year exhibition, the studio buzzed with energy. The walls shimmered with the new collection, a tapestry of emotions painted by women who had found their way through pain. Emma's own contribution this year was a massive piece titled, "The Light Beyond the Storm." It depicted a lone figure standing amidst a landscape of shattered glass, with sunlight breaking through clouds above her, a metaphor for the transformation that comes when one refuses to remain broken. The piece carried layers of symbolism, but to Emma it was simple. It was about her life and every life she had touched along the way. The event drew a crowd even larger than before. Reporters mingled with art lovers, curious visitors stopped in awe, and women who had once painted timidly beside Emma now stood proudly beside their own works. Clara, her beloved mentor, walked beside her with a proud smile. "You did it, Emma," she said softly, her eyes misting. "You built something that will outlive you." Emma squeezed her hand gently, her heart swelling. "No," she said. "We did it. Every woman who believed she could begin again. This belongs to all of them." As she moved through the crowd, greeting familiar faces, she suddenly noticed a figure standing quietly at the edge of the room. Daniel. He looked older, his face lined with fatigue that success could not disguise. He wasn't there to argue or reclaim what was lost. She could see that in his eyes. He approached her slowly, hesitant as if afraid his presence might disturb the peace that enveloped her world. "Emma," he began, his voice low, almost unsure. "I wanted to see your work. I've been hearing about it everywhere." She nodded politely, not cold, just composed. "I'm glad you came," she said. They stood in silence for a moment, surrounded by the hum of conversation. Two people who had shared a life but never truly lived it together. He looked at the painting, the light beyond the storm, and his expression softened. "It's beautiful," he said quietly. "It feels free." Emma's eyes followed his gaze, her voice steady but gentle. "It is," she replied. "Freedom isn't something someone gives you, Daniel. It's something you decide to take when you finally remember who you are." He nodded slowly, his shoulders heavy with unspoken regret. "I didn't know how much I was breaking when I tried to build," he admitted. She looked at him with compassion, not bitterness. "We all break things when we don't understand their value," she said softly. "But it's never too late to learn." He smiled faintly, a sad, quiet smile, and for the first time there was no tension between them, only understanding. "You look happy," he said. Emma's answer was simple. "I am." He nodded once more, and as he walked away, Emma felt no pain, no longing, no anger, and only closure. It was as if an old chapter had finally been sealed with peace, allowing her story to breathe freely. Later that evening, as the event drew to a close, Emma stepped outside onto the terrace overlooking the city. The air was cool, the lights below flickering like scattered stars. She closed her eyes and let the wind brush against her skin. The same wind that once felt cold but now felt like freedom. She thought of every step that had led her here, the humiliation that had broken her heart, the nights she had cried alone, the mornings she had chosen to keep going, the courage it took to believe again. Every fragment of her pain had become a piece of her strength, every scar a line in the story of her rebirth. When she opened her eyes, she saw her students gathered inside, laughing, celebrating, alive. Women who had walked through their own storms and found their light. And she realized then that her purpose was far greater than she had ever imagined. Her life was no longer about survival. It was about giving others the tools to survive too. She wanted to write a book, a memoir that told her story honestly, not as tragedy but as triumph. A story that could reach women beyond her studio, across borders, across languages. A story that whispered, "You can start again. You can always start again." Weeks later, she began to write. Each evening after the studio closed, she sat by her window with her notebook, pouring her heart onto paper. The words came easily, as though they had been waiting all along for her to find the courage to let them breathe. She wrote about love and loss, strength and silence, pain and power. She wrote about the night she was humiliated in front of a crowd, and the morning she decided to stop being invisible. She wrote about her awakening, her art, and the women who had become her sisters in resilience. And as she wrote, she realized that healing wasn't a destination. It was a journey that kept evolving. Months later, when the book was published, it found readers far beyond her city. Letters poured in from women across the world, from mothers in small towns, from widows, from young girls chasing dreams, from survivors who had thought they were alone. Each letter carried a piece of gratitude, a reflection of courage rediscovered. Emma read every one, often with tears in her eyes, realizing that her story had become a lantern for others lost in their own storms. On a quiet evening not long after, she stood in her garden again, barefoot on the grass, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. The world was at peace, the air scented with jasmine, and the sound of laughter floated faintly from the studio nearby. She felt the earth beneath her feet and smiled, truly smiled, a smile that came not from achievement but from alignment. She whispered softly to herself, "I made it through." And she had. She had walked through fire and come out gold. The woman who once stood trembling in a ballroom, humiliated and small, had become a force of grace, resilience, and inspiration. Her story was not one of revenge, but of redemption. Not of fighting others, but of finding herself. And as the sky dimmed into twilight, Emma Richards closed her eyes, breathing in the beauty of her own becoming, knowing that life had finally come full circle. She was no longer a shadow. She was the light beyond the storm.